Hello. So just want to review some results from an IG Instagram poll that I took a while back. Um, by no means was this an in-depth scientific study, but it was mainly just to confirm a couple of hypotheses that I had about personality traits and gender. And it did, in fact, do that. So, very simple. Just asked a question. Do you tend to absorb your environment, deflect your environment, or reflect your environment? So, simple question, three options. My general hypothesis is that I predicted that, generally speaking, most men tend to deflect their environment, and more women would tend to absorb their environment. And that is indeed what the poll showed. But here are a few of the findings. So a few dozen people participated in the poll, 49 to be exact, with 20 of them being male and 39 being female. I was actually quite pleased about the turnout, as I think it gave an accurate distribution of people overall, as well as between the genders. It also helps that uh, I was I was also at least fairly well acquainted with everyone who took the poll. So my verification of the results comes through that, through my actually knowing some of these people, or knowing at least enough about them to have draw some conclusions about certain personality traits and why they voted a certain way. Um, I have quite a large library of astrological birth charts. I am an astrologer. I have the charts of a lot of people that I know. So quite a few of those people, I actually had their charts as well. And there were a few somewhat notable conclusions that I was able to draw about that patterns that I saw in certain kinds of placements and things like that, or certain modal or elemental tendencies, we'll say, if you're at all into the astrology thing. It's not all that I do here on my channel. Okay. Um, so it helped that I did have some formal information about some of their personalities, as well as like Myers-Briggs types and things like that that are maybe slightly less formal, less fixed. So I was able to verify through my knowledge of these personality systems and my knowing these people to a certain extent, what traits contributed to their selecting the answer that they did. So here's some general conclusions based on the data. I'm not going to bore you with all the details about the thought process that went into the poll, about like detail for detail, participant by participant, those kinds of mundane details. That's just boring stuff anyway. Okay. So overall, 52% of participants reported to absorb their environment. Okay. Um, so one of those three choices had actually the slight majority of people answering, choosing that answer. The rest were distributed evenly at 24% each between deflect and reflect their environment. More women than men reported to absorb their environment, about 2/3, which was perfectly in line with my hypothesis. More and also more men than women reported to deflect their environment, again about 2/3. So both of those hypotheses turned out to be pretty clear. All who reported to reflect their environment were women. Okay, so remember there were 49 people total. Only 20 of them were male, 39 were female. So slightly significant higher number of females participated. So about 2/3 of men did what I expected them to do, deflect their environment. About 2/3 of women did what I expected them of them. They absorbed their environment, and then the rest were men who reported to absorb their environment, and women mixed between deflecting and reflecting. Okay. Now, some of this may have been due to the reflection having only women have that as an answer. It might be due to like men not, for some reason, understanding what that might mean. Like we've all heard in social contexts, at the very least, of people absorbing their environment and deflecting the content of their environment. So maybe the men were a little more inclined to like kind of choose without thinking too much about it, uh, absorb or deflect rather than thinking about what reflect means and choosing that option. I don't know. That's just a thought that I had. Whereas maybe the women would be more inclined to ruminate on, okay, I feel like I absorb it. Maybe I deflect sometimes. Oh, reflect. What does that mean? And then they kind of think about it. Anyway, maybe some of that will be reflected in the results and the rest of the significations of the results. So let's see. So personality differences among the outlying participants. So participants that did not fall in line with my hypothesis, men deflecting and women absorbing. What's up with the outliers? So the minority of men who reported to absorb their environment, I was able to conclude quite readily, in fact, that they are higher in trait agreeableness, according to the Big Five system, and overall they're more sensitive. And more so than the average man, the men who absorb their environment had notable artistic and creative inclinations and talents. Okay. So that should also come as no surprise that the men who absorb their environment tend to be more artsy, artistic, sensitive, emotionally in tune, or at least emotionally expressive, right? That's part of where creativity comes from, in large part, is from your experiences that you have absorbed from your environment, right? People who are more deflecting of their environment tend not to go through that emotional processing and then like having to find a creative outlet through which to express what they took from an experience, like a breakup or something like that. Okay. All great love songs were written by men who most likely absorb their environment rather than deflect it. Okay. People who deflect their environment tend to be a little more left brained, a little more logical, rational. If we're putting it in astrological terms, more Saturnian. Okay. Create a border, push out anything that doesn't conform to the rules that you set within the walls of those borders. Right. It's a rational, like kind of stoic approach to deflect your environment, to not take too much influence or be affected too much by your external environment. Right. So this can go not so well, obviously. You have to make a value judgment as far as like when is it appropriate to let certain things in, even if you are naturally a deflector. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, but there are times when you have to accept some influence, some absorption of the contents of your environment and go through the processing that's required to understand, to introspect, contemplate, understand how it is that your environment's affecting you. Okay. So anyway, moving on. Men who absorb tend to be higher in agreeableness, more sensitive, more emotionally expressive, more artistic and creative as well. Or at least they're inclined to express their emotions through artistic means. That doesn't imply that they're artistically creative and talented, right? Like you might need to like go play drums to let off some steam. Doesn't mean that you're creative. Like somebody who plays in nothing but cover bands is a musician. They're technically skilled, maybe, but are they creative? Are they artists? That person is not necessarily an artist unless you're creating something, right? So creativity is actually a different thing. I don't want to say that people who absorb their environment are more likely to be creative. That's not what I'm saying. Creativity is a particular personality dimension. It varies independently of all others for the most part. But falls in Big Five terms, it falls in line with openness, right? Openness to experience. So the minority of women who reported to deflect rather than absorb their environment, like the norm, I was able to very readily confirm that their personality were across the board more rational and intellectual than the average woman. Again, doesn't mean that you're not rational or intellectual just because you absorb your environment. It just means that you have more work to do to filter out things that are not conducive to rational thought. Okay. So the minority of women who deflect, more rational, more intellectual in their personality inclinations, because they, on a Big Five scale, they tend to be higher in intellect, which is one of the sub traits of openness. Okay. But that's not the norm for women, because in general, men are higher in intellect on the openness factor, and women are higher in openness to experience proper. So you could say that the women who chose the deflect option, who are more likely to deflect their environment than absorb it, maybe less emotionally expressive, more practical, more logical, more Saturnian, Capricornian, perhaps more, we'll say they're like a dude. They're kind of like one of the dudes in a way, in the way that they kind of at least try to put rationality first. I do kind of think that in general, whether you're a guy, a guy, girl, whatever, that emotionality wins out in the end. It's not necessarily that, some people go with the heart, other people go with the head. The people who go with the head, who lead with the head, are still driven and motivated by the heart. They just use the head to rationalize and justify that the direction they're going is the direction that they're going, and why. They're more likely to be able to give reasons for doing what they're doing. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing what's best for themselves, right? They might be doing what's more sensible, but what's more sensible is not necessarily conducive to your flourishing. Okay. So, talked about the outlying men and women. Now, those who reported to reflect their environment, remember, according to this poll that I took, they were all women. They have multiple personality factors. I was able to confirm because these particular women are people who I do know a little better personally for some reason. And or I did have more information about them. Like I did have their birth chart right in front of me, or like in my library, or I I'd had some kind of interaction with them at some point, or acquainted with them from a place of like me really having gotten to know their personality. Okay. Um, and I guess you're just gonna have to trust my word on this. Like I have no reason to lie about this crap. This is how it turned out. It turned out roughly how I would have expected. Okay. So those women who report to reflect their environment have multiple personality factors that make them unique among women and people in general regarding their purpose, their communication style, their hobbies and interests, and their ability to express themselves creatively. Maybe the only bias that I can see in that is that, okay, these particular women who are in this category happen to be some of my friends, and I know them better. Therefore, I know the complexities of their personalities better. But maybe I was connected through them to them and became friends with them or acquainted with them because I already maybe have more in common with them. Maybe I tend personally to attract reflector types, people who reflect their environment. I know for sure that I generally don't get along as well with people who absorb their environment. They're too sensitive for me, right? um, but the reflectors tended to be very complex compared to other women. Whereas we can point to hypergamy, right? The tendency for women, generally speaking, to partner and date and marry across and up the socioeconomic hierarchy. These women don't do that necessarily, the reflectors, the people who reported to be reflectors. And the same was true of some of the women who reported to deflect their environment. So the atypical women in the poll are not as hypergamous, we'll say. They don't care as much about status, like overt societal status in a partner. They tend to look for the kind of complexity that they actually possess. That's one of the reasons they reflect their environment to begin with, right? A lot of your what you attract in a partner is going to reflect something about you, whether it's the same thing or the opposite thing. So like I'm a deflector. In a partner, I attract someone who absorbs. I deflect, they absorb. Right. Two absorbers partnering together, that sounds like a bit of a mess. Two deflectors maybe would be inclined to avoid facing certain things because it would disrupt the flow of the rational structure that they've created. All right. Two reflectors together also kind of sounds like a mess, but it depends on the individuals. All right. Well, as it turns out, I tend to get along with reflectors, but none of them were like women that I dated or anything like that. So they're not like my type. So those are really all the conclusions I have for that poll, and a little bit of elaboration on the conclusions that I was able to draw from it. So for what it's worth, hope you enjoy the video. Kind of different one. I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.